Anyway, of course, I'm continuing talking about the rise of fascism, of course, this week. I think previously I had talked about, I think we were talking about Adolf Hitler rose to power in pretty much, would become Chancellor of Germany in 1933, 1933 to 30 to 45. Which really haven't got to yet, but I kind of just mentioned a little bit about that. And I think we mostly got into and we talked about mostly the rise of the Nazi Party, which came about by the 1920s in Germany during the so-called Weimar Republic. Because we talked about the Weimar Republic and how it really didn't work well and had all these economic problems that they had. And you had left wing versus radical right wing groups that tried to take over the country. So that's basically where we were at that point. So I want to go ahead and first talk about Hitler, in the 1920s and all that. Hitler, of course, would eventually come to power, of course, later. I didn't talk about some of the men that were under Hitler that helped him kind of rise to power, which I'll get to today. There's a lot of different men that were under him that were pretty powerful and later were part of the Nazi Germany as a whole. And first of all, you had Hermann Goering, who we'll kind of talk about later more. He was one of the close figures with Hitler. Goering was a ex-World War I ace. He actually flew at the Red Baron at one point in World War I. He was head of the Luftwaffe, and he actually was the one that at one point founded the Nazis' Gestapo later, which the Gestapo would be like the Third Reich's secret police that they're known for. It was kind of like the German version of the KGB. And also they believe that Hermann Goering was the one that opened the first concentration camps in Germany, like Dachau. It's very famous, of course. So he's a very, very important figure, Hermann Goering, but he's the head of the Luftwaffe, which is what they call the Nazi Germany's Air Force, which became pretty good, by the way, in World War II. Also, they got Heinrich Himmler. Himmler was the head of the Gestapo eventually. He's the one who kind of headed it up, mostly under Hitler. He was also head of what is called the SS, which was called the Schutzstaffel, which stood for the Protection Squadron. And they were known for their black-looking uniforms. They would have these SS labels that would be on their shirts. And if you know about the caps that they wore, they had the death's heads skull on their caps. And mostly they were started out as a paramilitary organization that broke off from the SA, the brown shirts. And over time, they dealt with like internal security in Nazi Germany. Later, they even had like these special forces that they developed too during World War II, like the Waffen SS, you may have heard of as well. Himmler and the SS were involved a lot in the Holocaust. As you know, they were the ones that were mostly behind the genocide of millions of Jews, which may have been maybe as many as 6 million Jews may have been killed. And the SS, of course, were famous for running a lot of the concentration and death camps in Germany and Poland and other areas. So they think the Nazis under Hitler and SS and all that may have killed as many as 10 to 15 million people. And that's a lot, of course, mostly in World War II. A few other men I'll talk about real quick. Ernest Röhm was the head of the that should be SA, got a typo there. Head of the SA is what it should be. And the SA was the what they called the typo there. SA was the head of was the Sturmabteilung, which meant either storm detachment or some people even called them the storm troopers. I think was another name they dubbed them. And they were known as the brown shirts. These were the original paramilitary force that Hitler developed. I think that group was very similar to Mussolini's black shirts, which were in Italy. And they acted as Hitler's like bodyguards. Like when you would go to do speeches or whatever, rallies, or in his old days, they used to meet in like a lot of beer pubs, and they call them like a beer hall is what it is. And they would protect him. And then they also went around beating up people that were against him, like socialists and communists, I guess, and stuff like that. And Hitler later took the SA and he merged with the German Wehrmacht and the SS over time. But the SA had at one point several million people in it, like they said in the video. You may have heard of Joseph Goebbels. He was also famous as well. He was Hitler's minister of propaganda. He dealt with like media, movies, newspapers, radio, stuff like that. And the Nazis used propaganda to basically control the population and brainwash them and, force their ideology on them. And so a lot of people believed them. They basically started talking about how Jews were like, roaches and cockroaches and rats, and they need to get rid of them. And they started to believe them. And a lot of the media today is kind of influenced by, believe it or not, Joseph Goebbels. Kind of like almost like, seems like the media today is kind of like almost like whatever they say is like true and maybe not. Might be like fake news, as they say sometimes. And so that's kind of like what it was. It was almost like fake news, and everybody believes it, stuff like that. Also, Martin Bormann was also pretty powerful too. You might have never heard of him, but he was Hitler's main secretary, like personal secretary and all that under him. And he also was the head of the chief Nazi party chancellery. He ran the chancellery building and all that. And he was really powerful. Like he was one of several men that were with Hitler to the end in 1945 when Hitler supposedly killed himself in his bunker. Joseph Goebbels actually died too with Hitler too at the end. All right, talk about what happened. Now, in 1923, Hitler tried to seize power. Now, the little video kind of showed you that a little bit about that background, and they called it the Beer Hall Push in November of 1923. And what happened was Hitler thought that he could seize power in Germany like Mussolini did in Italy. And so he had this idea to march on the buildings, I guess, in what is Munich, Bavaria, and seize control of the state there. It was like a coup, attempted coup anyway. About 3,000 Nazis participated in it. It's called Beer Hall Push because it was supposedly started a beer hall, they say, in Munich. I think the Hofbrauer House, I think, was one of them that they started supposedly. And anyway, the coup d'etat failed. About 16 Nazis were actually shot dead, killed. And Hitler and I think Goering and a few others were arrested for it, for trying to commit high treason and trying to overthrow the government. And he eventually was sentenced to 5 years, but he only served about 9 months. The video didn't really go into that, but the reason why he only served about 9 months, probably should have got death penalty, but the reason why was because his trial became kind of a sensation. And of course, they probably made a mistake and they let him get up there and speak. And of course, great speaker, that Hitler is. His testimony made him seem like this great patriot that was trying to fight against, the more socialist type government, which some people didn't like. And the judge, who was kind of a Nazi sympathizer, basically shortened his term. I think it was set up where some Nazis kind of put the right judge in, and that's why his term was actually shortened and all that. Hitler would serve actually in what is called the Landsberg prison castle, which actually was turned later into an SS prison, where the SS would torture and kill a lot of people. It's kind of ironic about that. But when he was in prison, he decided to write a book about his experiences, which became like his autobiography, but it was also like a political testament about what he wanted to do with the Nazi movement and all of that. And the book became known as Mein Kampf, is what they called it, which means my struggle. Although that wasn't the original name. It was actually going to be called 4.5 Years of Struggle Against Lies, Stupidity, and Cowardice. And so they thought that wouldn't work as a title. So he came up with Mein Kampf, which meant my struggle or my battle, which was published in 1925. And it became a very popular book, by the way, in Germany, which a lot of people didn't read, believe it or not. But it helped propel him, like his career back to the Nazi movement. I think he made a lot of money off of the royalties from it, if you read about it. Mein Kampf is kind of important because it does discuss a lot of his ideas in it. Like he talks about the Germans being the Aryan master race, that they're better than other races, that all the other races are weaker. Whether you're talking about Jews or Slavs or any other group, he believes that the Germans were considered superior. The Germans even started talking about German science and all this other stuff, German blood, all that stuff. He wanted to get rid of communism. So he realized that the enemy of basically Germany was basically the like Soviet Union, communism. He blamed the Jews for it, of course. Also, he wanted to get revenge for Versailles. That's became one of his big things that he would talk about in a lot of his speeches. It was the stab in the back, the whole thing where the Weimar Republic, basically agreed to this, this Treaty of Versailles. And of course, the book also talks about the idea of Lebensraum, the idea that Germany needed living space to expand its population. And of course, he saw that in the East, like Eastern Europe, where they expand there, conquer it, colonize it. And so that's something he will actually try to do later, before and during World War II. And also annexing Austria was another idea, of course, that Hitler wanted to do as well. Hey, Alexander, but Anschluss was this idea to annex Austria, his native land, into the Third Reich. And that's something he would do in 1938, which I'll get to later. If you go back, of course, and look at that little short video, they talk about the Great Depression as being a major issue of why the Nazis become popular. People start listening to Hitler because nobody has jobs. About 6 million Germans were unemployed in 1932. I think in America, we had 25% unemployed during the Great Depression, all caused by the stock market crash in the United States, of course. And so because of it, the Nazi Party became one of the largest political parties in Germany. See, 5 million members by 1932. And so that's why, Hitler was able to eventually come to power at that point. So what happened was, because of the Nazi popularity, Hitler decided to run for president of Germany, which he would do, which is very important because it would help the Nazis in the 1932 German elections and all that. He ran against a man named Paul von Hindenburg, who was already the president of Germany. I think I've got a picture of Hindenburg I can show you. Right here, Hindenburg. Hindenburg, of course, was a war hero. He, of course, had fought on the German side against France and Britain and the U.S. And he's the one, of course, that later appoints Hitler as chancellor. And you may have heard of the Hindenburg Zeppelin that blew up. That's kind of named for him, which was, I think, built later. But that's him. He's going to pretty much open the door for Hitler, coming to power. And how did Hitler do in the election? Hitler actually came in second place. He actually flew around, by the way, Germany. That's one thing he became very famous for, by the way. He was like one of the first major politicians to use an airplane, fly all over Germany to campaign, and all that. But he still lost to the incumbent, Hindenburg. But like it says, it did give the Nazis a majority in the Reichstag, in the German parliament, and that was really one of the turning points that allowed the Nazis to eventually get in power. And so, because of the fact that that happens, Hindenburg was eventually was forced to appoint him Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany because he was the leader of the majority party, which is the Nazis. And so he came to power on January 30th, 1933. Yeah, January 30th, 1933. And Hindenburg, thought he could control it. Of course, Hindenburg would die within a year or so, after that. But a lot of historians seem to think when Hitler would come to power that would eventually cause the beginning of the so-called Third Reich, or what we call the Nazi Germany, which would last from 1933 to 1945. lasted a little over 12 years. And of course, the Nazis called it the 1,000-Year Reich. They thought it would last 1,000 years, but it lasted about 12 years, and I want to say 4 months, roughly. What's going to happen is when Hitler comes in, within about a year, which is true from 1933 to 1934, he actually turns Germany into this totalitarian one state that's run by the Nazis. It's a one-party state, which is what it is. And I need, of course, to get into and talk about how he was able to do this. It basically had to do with an incident that happened right when he came in, which has kind of been a debate about, who was really behind it and all of that. But actually it was caused by this fire in the Reichstag called the Reichstag fire, which happened on February 27th, 1933. And apparently this communist, who I think was an anarchist too, named Marinus van der Lubbe, was actually arrested for burning it down. He actually, I think several times he confessed to it. And he was later executed for it in 1934. Of course, there's been a lot of debate about whether who was behind it. Did he really do it, or was it like a what do they call that? One of those false flag attacks. Some people think it may have been the Nazis may have done it themselves, burn it down. But I think they seem to think that van der Lubbe may have actually done it because he thought he could start a revolution which would overthrow the Nazis. But it ended up doing the opposite. It actually put the Nazis more in power, is what it did. What happened was the Nazis used it as a pretext to basically take over the state. And so because the excuse was that the communists are trying to take over the country. So we better get in and take over, just what happened in Italy. Same thing with Mussolini, the fascists, same threat, I guess. And so this was done through two actual laws, the Reichstag Fire Decree, and they also had the Enabling Act, which were like February, March of 1933. Both those laws, what they did was it basically made the Nazi Party the only legal political party that you could join. So you couldn't be in any other political party. So basically that meant that Germany was now this one-party state run by the Nazis. It also suspended people's civil liberties as well. And then the other thing it did too, which I think the Enabling Act was the main one that did that, it also created, it basically gave Hitler the right to create all the laws, like a decree or laws or whatever it is. And so that basically meant that Hitler was pretty much like a totalitarian dictator. So basically that's how he was able to basically take over and create this Nazi totalitarian state through using democracy, believe it or not. Then he turns around and creates this Nazi revolution, if you want to call it, where they basically just do that. So that's basically, how Hitler was able to do that and seize power. Then what happened after that, of course, Hindenburg, you probably wonder what happened. What was the deal with Hindenburg? Well, Hindenburg went along with it because Hindenburg was kind of also fearful that the communists might take over too, because they had tried before. I think back in 1919, the communists had tried to seize power. So they're thinking again, it might happen again. And so he went along with Hitler because that's what a lot of times the chancellor will do, advise the president what to do with the state. And so he went along with him. Now, also, Hitler was also pro-military, which, Hindenburg liked as well, even though I think Hindenburg really didn't like Hitler deep down because I don't know if he really liked the Nazis, but he really didn't like the fact that Hitler was not much of a military guy, But Hindenburg would actually die in office. And so, natural causes. And so what that would do, it would allow Hitler to eventually take over total control, as a one dictator. And what happens, if you know about Hitler eventually what he does, he purges the Nazi Party of anybody that's a threat to him. Most of the people he got rid of were people that were either liberal or seen as a threat to him politically within the party. And it was called different names. They often call it the Nazi blood purge. Some people also call it the Night of the Long Knives, because it started on the night of June 30th, 1934. Actually lasted over a period of like 3 days. And they also call it the Röhm push because what he did was he arrested Ernest Röhm, who was the head of the SA, Brown Shirts, and he had him shot. Got rid of him. So I think they say Ernest Röhm was the only guy that was really a threat to him politically. Then if you know what happened after that, Hitler then held this referendum, if you know about it, where they voted to basically make Hitler what they call Führer, the leader of Germany, which was actually where they combined the chancellorship with the presidency. So he basically had both positions pretty much. They say that about 90% of the population voted yes for Hitler to become the Führer, which probably was accurate. People really liked him a lot. I wonder what happened to the 10% that didn't vote for him. You got to wonder about that one. They probably got in big trouble. So basically with that, up to that point with him becoming the Führer overall, what it does, it gives him total power over Germany as a totalitarian dictator. He also has the armed forces, which is the German Wehrmacht, take an oath to him, cementing the military as well, which Hitler will use that later, to start World War II in the future. So that's how Hitler was able to do all this to eventually, seize power and take over all of Germany. So he did all this pretty much through democracy and then turned around and took over the whole country. So I need to get into, of course, here's another picture of Mussolini and Hitler. I'll talk about that later. Of course, he's going to help form the Axis powers later. But let's talk about next what Hitler does after he comes to power. Now, Hitler next will actually, after he solidifies his power, he's going to begin to try and get revenge for the Treaty of Versailles. And what's going to happen, one of the things that happens with the Nazis, Nazi Germany, was that they began trying to rearm their country, which had been, pretty much de-armed by the Treaty of Versailles. So he starts, building up their armed forces. He starts, building the Luftwaffe, German Air Force, starts conscripting millions of men. They brought conscription back. So men got conscripted into the military. And then, of course, the other thing he did, too, is going to start retaking territory that the Germans had lost in World War I. Those are the main areas they'll try to take back. Rhineland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. He'll try to take over those areas and add those to the Third Reich and all that. And part of why he's able to do this is because the West is really weak. They're really unable to really stop Hitler. A lot of it was because of several reasons. One you see there is that the weakness of the League of Nations has a lot to do with it. The League of Nations was not that powerful. I think the most they could do is maybe enforce some kind of embargo, which a lot of times didn't work. And Italy and Germany, as examples, and even Japan later, left the League of Nations. They refused to deal with it, more or less. The Western powers also preferred to use diplomacy because of going back to the League of Nations and Treaty of Versailles. So they thought that was a way to stop fascism. Also, a lot of the allies in the West, like France, Britain, didn't want to fight World War II because they just fought World War I and lost a lot of men. So they weren't really interested in really doing that. The Germans were interested in getting revenge for World War I was the problem. So all that's not going to stop Hitler from really rising to power and starting World War II, which will break out in 1939. One more thing that happened too also was in 1936, the Nazi Germany formed what is called the Axis powers, which, if you know about it, became the main alliance in World War II. They would fight the Allied powers. First had Germany formed an alliance with Italy and Mussolini in 1936. Then in 1940, Japan joined, and that became known as the Tripartite Pact. But they also call it Axis powers. They had minor states in it later that fought, like I think Hungary was in it and Romania, etc. But those are just minor countries. But those are the three main countries that were basically allied together. And like in World War II, like the main allies later that'll fight will be like Britain, France, Soviet Union, U.S., China, are the main ones that actually fight the Axis powers. And that's later, though. I was talking about different territories that the, of course, Nazis took back. The first one that the Germans took back was actually what is called the Rhineland, which is a land that's on the western side of Germany with the French border. That had been a DMZ, demilitarized zone. And what happened was Hitler decided to march in there, take it over, I think with about 30, 40,000 troops. The Allies didn't stop him. He just walked in there and took it. And so he began to kind of rearm that area, kind of build fortifications there later to defend that area against France. And then, of course, the most controversial thing that happened was in 1938. He decided to try to annex Austria. This happened in March of 1938, which the Nazis had been trying to do for like a couple years. And anyway, I think what happened was the Austrians were fearful that they would get invaded, and so they let Hitler and the Nazis march in, take over. Suppose they had some kind of referendum too there, where they voted to join Nazi Germany. And so Anschluss became basically what they call the joining. That's what it means, joining of Austria with Germany. That's what it means in German, joining. And then they had this other thing that happened too, which was a big thing that almost caused World War II in 1938, which was the Germans wanted control of Western Czechoslovakia, which had been part of Germany going back to prior to World War I. And this was called the Sudetenland. This becomes known as the Sudetenland Crisis, and occurs in September. Hitler demands that that area be given to him because they don't. He's going to invade and take it. And he says the reason why they want it is because there's like a few million, I want to say 3 or 4 million, what they call ethnic Germans. They called them Sudetenland Germans, lived there. He thought they should be under the Third Reich. And so finally what happened was the countries in the West, France and Britain, decided to intervene because they were worried about, World War II breaking out in 1938. So they went to Germany, and at what is a diplomatic conference in Munich, Germany, in Bavaria, they met at the end of September. And it's got all kinds of names. I think some people call it the Munich Conference is one name they called it, although a lot of people call it the Munich Agreement or Munich Pact, usually. Happened over like a 2-day period from September 29th to September 30th. The Czechs later call it the Munich Betrayal because basically what happened was the West agreed to basically give it away. They decided, hey, you can have it in exchange for peace. More or less, we're not going to war. And there was a man that actually developed this. He was very famous. I think I've got a picture of him. He was actually behind it. Where is he? Somewhere here. Oh, there he is right there. Neville Chamberlain. He was, of course, the prime minister of Britain. He believed that that the best way to do that would be to basically give the territory away in exchange for peace. This was viewed as being like a form of appeasement. So it's really considered one of the best examples of appeasement that was ever done between the wars. And it failed. It didn't work. They thought it would stop Hitler because I think what Chamberlain tried to do, he said, hey, Hitler will give you this territory, and that's all you're going to take. You can't have any more, or we'll have a war. And so he made Hitler sign that piece of paper there you're seeing there, which basically said that Hitler wasn't going to seize any more territory after the Sudetenland. Of course, that proved to be a lie. And of course, Chamberlain came back to England, and he, of course, presented this paper to everybody. And he said the famous statement. He said, "I believe it is peace in our time." And of course, that proved to be totally wrong. which they find out later, 1939. I think the only guy that kind of stood up to was Winston Churchill. He thought that they really were really getting war later. But most of the people in Britain were pretty much for what he did. But the Czechs got betrayed. They were betrayed by what happened with this, and half their country, got taken over by the Nazis. And what happened, if you know what happened afterwards, they got fooled, if you know about it. The Nazis then in 1939, I want to say April or May or something like that, in early 1939, the spring, took the rest of Czechoslovakia. They marched in with their forces. They took the eastern half of it as well. And so at that point, they realized that they can't really take Hitler serious anymore with that. And Hitler even begins planning to invade Poland by the spring of 1939. He's already planning it at that point because he wants Poland also as well. So that's the kind of stuff that's kind of going on pretty much prior to when, of course, World War II breaks out. These are all the different causes, by the way, of World War II. Pretty much we've talked about most of these. Treaty of Versailles, extreme nationalism, especially, of course, depression, dictatorships, policy of appeasement. Also, American isolationism. Of course, the United States became very isolated, between the wars, and we didn't really want to get involved. So we weren't really much of a threat to really stop any of these, dictators. And then, of course, the main cause, the direct cause, why the war broke out, of course, is because the fact that the Nazis eventually invaded Poland. That's the big thing, of course, that happened. And what happened was right before that, which is kind of important, by the way, Nazi Germany made this deal with the Soviet Union. This happened in August of 1939, August 23rd, to be exact. It's called all kinds of names. It was called some people call it the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, or people call it also the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And what happened was the two states, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, agreed to a non-aggression deal where they wouldn't fight each other for 10 years. Because Stalin really didn't want to fight Nazi Germany because he thought it was too powerful and all that. He was worried about war breaking out with Hitler. And so that was something that Hitler was behind trying to get developed, even though he hated the Soviets and all that. And I'll get to why he did it. But also what they did was they agreed that if Nazi Germany did invade Poland, which it was planning in 1939, that they'd split it in half, and that the Nazis would get the western half and the Soviets would get the eastern half. And the Soviets would be allowed, by the way, to control the Baltic states like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And Hitler did this, about why, because he wanted to prevent Nazi Germany from having to fight a two-front war. He knew if he attacked Poland, what's going to happen is France and Britain are going to declare war on it. That's what he felt like was going to happen, of course, because they promised they were going to protect Poland, by the way. So he knew that. So he didn't want to have to fight that way and then have to fight the Russians all over again. So that's the reason why the Nazis made that deal. And of course, the deal didn't last long, if you know about it. Eventually, they end up in a war, eventually fighting each other. How long it lasts? Like 22 months? Yeah, that's about 22 months. I think it's 22 or 23 months. But Hitler later turned on the Soviets and attacked them in June of 1941. So let's get into the war. Of course, that's the next thing, of course, we're moving on to talk about, of course, is World War II and all that. That topic, of course, overall, which I'll be talking about over probably a couple of days more. So basically what starts World War I at this point is Hitler, of course, invades Poland, like I said, September 1st. Of course, you see there, September 1st, 1939. Of course, what happened was the Germans amassed forces in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and also East Prussia. And basically, this sparks the war, World War II in Europe. And immediately, I think on September 3rd, 2 days later, France and Britain declared war on Germany at this point. And you can see there the war itself would last about 6 years, because I think the War II lasts until September 2nd, 1945, when Japan officially surrendered to the United States. So, yeah, it almost lasted about 6 years to the day. They think 60 million people died in the war. So that's like almost like 10 million a year died, which is a lot of people. And the Poles, like Poland, like their military forces, they really couldn't do anything. They got overmatched, of course, really quick. Within a month, like a few weeks, like 3-4 weeks or so, the German forces basically overrun Western Poland, taking like Warsaw and a bunch of their main cities. And the Germans used a new form of warfare that was called Blitzkrieg, which means in German, lightning war. This was like a new form of warfare where it was a type of offensive warfare where they concentrated using like mass tanks, like a lot of tanks and other self-propelled type, machines, trucks. Used a lot of planes, like fighters and bombers. Then also they coordinated also troops as well on the ground. So it was a new kind of form of warfare that probably started back in World War I, sort of. But this kind of coordination of warfare would allow the Nazis from like 1939 to like 1941-42 to conquer a lot of territory throughout most of Europe. They conquer almost most of Europe. Nazi Germany at one point. So Poland gets invaded. If you go back to this map up here, the Soviets came in too. So here you can see Poland on this side's wiped out. And then, of course, you've got basically the Soviets come over here, the Germans and Soviets. And so after that, Poland's gone. It's not a state anymore. It's occupied by these two powers. France and Britain did not declare war on the Soviet Union, even though they came in and did this. And Soviet Union stayed neutral in the war from 1939 to 1941, but they were somewhat allied with the Germans because they still gave them supplies and stuff to help them feed the war. So basically, so that's the beginning of the war. The Germans, invade Poland. Warsaw's taken at that point. And so that's the beginning of, World War II in Europe overall. There, of course, is picture, of course, the Blitzkrieg and all that, which pretty much most of World War II is like an offensive war, compared to like World War I that was more defensive throughout most of the war overall. Now, talk briefly about what happened after Poland. Now, after Poland, there was this incident that they call the Phony War. It's usually spelled that way. That's the British way they spell it. They also spell it without an E. But the Phony War was this lull that happened after Poland fell, which lasted about 8 months. I think it started maybe around September, and it goes all the way to like April, May of 1940. And neither side really did much in the war. Not too much fighting. I think there was some fighting in like the Atlantic, naval-wise, that occurred. And then also the Germans took over Denmark right above Germany. Then they hopped the Baltic and they seized control of Norway. This happened like around April 1940. That's about it that happened in the war. And the Germans call that period of the war, they call it the Sitzkrieg, or sit-down war, because neither side was really fighting. So some people thought the war was going to end, and that Hitler just wanted to take over Poland, and that was it. But that proved to be wrong. He starts attacking in the West. And then Hitler was already planning to invade the West as well, but he was kind of waiting for the winter to subside before he attacked the West. And he did have invasion plans. He had this plan called Case Yellow, that they had called Case Gelb. By the way, the one for, I don't know if I mentioned earlier, I mentioned that one too. The one for Poland was called Fall Weiss or Case White. They kind of named it after these different names, which were like code names that they called it more or less. But that's the name that they called it for invading the West, Case Yellow or Fall Gelb. And the plan was to invade the West, seize control of the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France, to take over that as well. And it was actually called another name that they called it, which is called the Manstein Plan. It was actually named after this guy named General von Manstein, who actually developed most of it. And what he did, Manstein came with this idea to attack the Allies in the West through what is called the Ardennes Forest, which is in part of Belgium and France. That's close to the German border. And so the Germans in May of 1940, what they did was they concentrated their forces right there in the Ardennes Forest. And what happened was, look at these maps here, the Germans eventually broke through the Ardennes, which is up in here, where the Belgian-French border is, where the town of Sedan is, which is right here. So they broke through, mostly using like tank forces. They were led by this guy named Heinz Guderian, who was considered to be one of the, I guess, the fathers of German tank fighting. He wrote a book called, what's the name of the book? It's called Achtung Panzer, I think it's called, which is pretty good. And anyway, what happened was the German forces then raced towards the English Channel. The French and the British tried to stop it. They had this thing called Weygand's Plan, where this French general came up with this idea to try to, the British got trapped up here and the French were down here. They thought they might be able to try to stop it, but they got cut in half by the German forces. And the Germans went all the way up here to where Calais is, close to Dunkirk. And what happened was eventually it formed a huge Allied pocket in northern France and part of Belgium that became known as the so-called Dunkirk pocket, which you may have heard of. Yeah, so-called Dunkirk pocket forms. They're cut in half, basically. French are mostly in the north with the, some of the French were in there too. Most of the French were trapped below, of course, as well. And so this huge Allied pocket is surrounded with several 100,000 troops who are trapped in it. By the way, the British realize they can't get out. And so their only choice really is to basically evacuate their forces. And so one of the things that the British do, if you know it, is they have this operation that's called Operation Dynamo. They called it, which happened in late May to June of 1940 under Vice Admiral Ramsay. He basically would evacuate the British forces and whoever, some of the French that could go along with it as well. And actually men actually had to line up on the beaches and wait for ships to come in to get people out, pretty much. So thousands did this over like a week or so, basically. I think it was, June 27th, June 20, May 27th or 28th, I think is when it started. And it went up to like June 4th or so. But about 300,000 or more troops were actually gotten out, mostly British with some French, were able to get out. But they had to leave all their equipment behind. They didn't want the Germans to seize it all. But at least they got all their men out. And that would be important later, if you study about it. And you study about the whole thing. It was called the Miracle at Dunkirk. That was one of the nicknames that they called Operation Dynamo, Miracle at Dunkirk, because they were able to get all these people out at one point. So that's kind of what's going on with that at that point. But France doesn't do well after that. You know what happens after that? The Germans eventually seize control of France. They march in there and take it easily within a couple weeks. And they call it the Battle of France. If you want to call it that. It was more like a massacre. They got beat pretty bad. I want to say is it 6 weeks? I think it was like 6 weeks. In 6 weeks they get beat. Yeah, from May 10th to about June 22nd, I think was the official date they surrendered to the Germans. And the Nazis would take Paris on June 16th. And then what happened was they forced the French to sign a armistice. And guess what they did? Forced Compiègne. Now, they went back to where the original surrender was in November 1918, and they made the French eat crap. They made them basically sign the same rail car, which I think was a museum at the time, and Hitler had it blown up. Because I guess they didn't want to sign again later if they lose. So anyway, that's kind of Hitler got his revenge, for basically that. But yeah, what were the surrender terms, by the way, for the French? Well, the French, after they lost the war to the Germans, they basically had knocked out the war. France was actually divided in half. The northern part was what they called occupied France, which was occupied by the Germans. The Germans wanted to control the northern part of France so they could have bases on the Atlantic and the western part of France. And then also they wanted to use France to attack Britain, try to seize it next. Southern France, which is on the Mediterranean Sea, was a state that was called Vichy France. Vichy France was this French pro-Nazi state that was set up. It was led by Philippe or Henry Pétain. He was a famous, war hero from the Battle of Verdun. He was put in power as its main leader. I think he was like the president of it. And basically, for a few years, it basically acted as like a pro-Nazi state or pro-Axis state. And they set that up because they didn't want the French, like its colonies and all that, to leave. And they wanted support from them. And I think they feared that their navy would also, ally with the Allied powers and all that. You can see that's the area where they would, of course, separate the two states pretty much. And Germany, I think, took the Alsace-Lorraine, by the way, which is right here, which they got back. So what else, too? Also, another thing happened to Charles de Gaulle, who was a French general, who was on the losing side at the end of the war. He fled the country. He didn't want to have anything to do with the Nazis, and he went to Britain. And what he did was he set up a French government in exile, which became known as the Free France government. That's what they called it. And he even set up military forces that supported the Free French, which fought the Free French. That's what they called it. That fought with the Allied powers in the war. These are pro-French forces that were anti-Nazi, and so they were called Free French forces, usually. And they think they were the ones, the Free France government was the one that kind of supported the French resistance movement in France, which tried to thwart the Germans over there and try to get them out. But it wouldn't be until 1944 until the Allies were able to really defeat the Germans and most of France, kick them out, which will take a while. After France fell, one of the things that happened, if you know about it, was that Britain was now the only country that was fighting Germany. They were for like almost a year. They fought by themselves, which was really a dark period in British history at that time. And of course, Winston Churchill came in. He came in as the prime minister about when the Battle of France is going on and all of that. And he basically became one of the greatest leaders in World War II. I don't know. Without him, I don't think they would have won the war, more or less. And about Churchill. Churchill was famous for his speeches, like the Never Surrender speech. I think was considered to be one of the greatest speeches he gave in 1940. That the British will fight on. They'll fight everywhere. They can on the seas and on the beaches to defeat Nazis. And he kind of compared the Nazis to the Dark Ages, them coming in and all that. And so that what happened next, we study about the Nazis and the British, they would eventually tangle in what became known as the Battle of Britain, which happened in the end of 1940. And the Battle of Britain is probably considered the first major battle, really, of the war. And occurs about like the end of the year. It was part of like this attempted invasion that Hitler wanted to do to occupy Britain next, and maybe knock them out the war. And so he had this plan he had called Operation Sea Lion, where he was going to amass a bunch of ships in an amphibious invasion, try to take it, but it never happened. He was unable to take out their air force and all of that. And so the Battle of Britain kind of became this air battle that was fought between their different prospective air forces. The British had the what they call the Royal Air Force, or RAF, I told you. And then the Germans had the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force, Nazi Germany's Air Force, which at the time was supposedly pretty good, the Luftwaffe. And the British, though, had an advantage for different reasons. One was that they were fighting kind of above Britain. So a lot of the airspace where they fought, or if they did, they fought over the English Channel, either one of those. They had an advantage because they didn't have to fly as far, say the Germans did, which were flying, I think, from either France or Norway to attack Britain. And also at the time they had radar was invented. If you know about it, and radar kind of had been something that was an advantage that they had because they knew where the planes were coming in. What they did was they divided Britain into what they call radar sectors. And so if a plane came into a certain sector, they would send planes up to attack them. So it gave them a real big advantage, more or less. They say that the Battle of Britain changed, and why the British eventually won was the Germans decided to concentrate on attacking cities instead of like military targets. And so they began this campaign to bomb London and other British cities as a form of terror bombing to basically get them to stop. And the bombing of London is one of the first of many civilian bombings that World War II is known for. The Allies bombed the hell out of Germany, during the war, which killed a lot of people. We did the same thing in Japan, the United States, also as well. So that's why World War II had such high casualty rates, because of all the civilian bombing that they did, of course, in the war. And the bombing of London and some of the cities was often called either the London Blitz, but I think in Britain today they call it the Blitz, is what they called it. And it went on for days, for several months, actually, the Blitz. And up to like 40 to 50,000 people died in the Blitz. They were killed by bombings, and they actually had to evacuate to even like the Tube, if you know what that is, which is the London subway and all that, to get away from people. And but they say in the end that because of this, trying to bomb, Britain, the Germans end up losing a lot of planes and pilots, which caused Hitler to eventually give up on that battle to try to take Britain. And the Luftwaffe lost something like 1,733 planes, but the RAF lost 1,379. So it looked like both of them together lost over 3,000 planes. That's a lot. So definitely considered one of the first big air battles really in history. But in the end, like I said, it was considered a victory for the Allied side in Britain, not being able to get taken over by Hitler. One more thing I'll talk about, and that's it. Hitler also turned his sights on the Soviet Union next. He couldn't defeat the British. He thought, I'll get them later, that kind of thing. And so Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union in June of 1941. It was part of a big operation that was called Operation Barbarossa, which was a military code for the invasion and also the conquest of the Soviet Union, which was, by the way, supposed to take place in a few months. They thought it was just going to be a really quick campaign like Poland and France were. It involved something like 3 to 4 million troops were involved. They also had other Axis powers like Italy put up forces, Romania, Hungary had some forces which were not as reliable, but they fought also in the invasion of the Soviet Union. And Hitler invaded the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, and they overrun Eastern Europe with their forces over a couple months. They take Eastern Poland, they push into Belarus. They also take over the Ukraine and eventually encircled like Kiev. And they say in the first part of the war, like the first, I think it's like 2 months, the Soviets lose something like 2.5 million men were actually killed or captured by the Germans. So it looked like the Soviet armies were going to collapse. It looked like they were going to get beat and all that. Also, Nazi Germany also tried to take what is Leningrad, which is what the Soviets called St. Petersburg, which is located near the Baltic Sea. And they weren't able to take it, but they laid siege to it for like over 2 years, and it resulted with a lot of Soviet citizens dying from starvation because sometimes they were cut off from supplies. Hitler also tried to drive on Moscow, but that was a failure. And one of the things that would happen, if you know about it, was that the Russian winter came in and kind of helped, the Soviet side. And so they were unable to really finish the campaign. The Operation Barbarossa actually stalled at the end of 1941, but it opened up a new front. It opened up what became known as the Eastern Front in 1941. And the Eastern Front would end up being the bloodiest conflict really in the whole World War II. The amount of deaths in World War II would end up being something like 30 million on the Eastern Front. So half the people or more that died in World War II died on the Eastern Front. I think China had like 10 million deaths, to give you an idea of how many deaths there were in World War II. And the Soviets and Russia today started calling it later, if you know about it, the Great Patriotic War. And so a lot of Soviet men, would participate in the war. And I think like 10 million Soviet soldiers actually died in the war. That's a lot. I think we had 10 million men in the war itself. They had like supposedly 10 million died, which is crazy. So that's it for now. Later, I'm going to, of course, next week, I'll talk about how the United States gets in the war. We're going to talk about, how, America gets in World War II because the Japanese, attacked Pearl Harbor. So I'll be getting into that next week and all of that. And before I go, when I come back next week, I'll do some reviewing. I haven't done that yet lately, but I'll review this section. But mostly next week, I'll be concentrating on talking a lot about World War II, which will probably get most of it done. But I did want to remind you before I go, don't forget about assignments due this week. You got those 2 Canvas quizzes due, of course. Book reports, try to get those uploaded by Saturday. And then don't forget about the vocab. You got a new vocab, the 3rd one, of course, that's due this week as well. So y'all take care. I hope y'all have a good weekend coming up. And that's it for this lecture. Don't forget, if you have any comments, questions about the lecture, let me know and send those to me on YouTube. If you have any questions about the class, just email me. Okay, so y'all take care and have a good weekend, like I said. So see you later.